Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group's 2023 to 2024 program. It's complicated. This year's sessions seek to reclaim the phrase "it's complicated" as a tool for unraveling nuanced colonial issues surrounding heritage throughout time. To this end, today we hosted a panel, "It's Complicated: Heritage, Law, and Ethics." I'd like to welcome our panel speakers, John Carman and Shubhangni Gupta. John Carman has spoken and published widely on heritage over the years. He has specific interest in what we mean by heritage in the first place, the kinds of values we place on what we call heritage, and how these relate to institutions of governance and ownership. Shubhangni Gupta is a PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology, Stanford University. Her project studies practices of heritage vis-a-vis the Shekhawati Haveli in Rajasthan, India. She's interested in analyzing the relationship between forms of expertise and ownership in spaces of heritage practice and preservation, and how different experts insert themselves as stakeholders in local community practice. We shall begin with John's presentation, followed by Shubhangini's. John's topic today will be, "Yes, it really is complicated, law and heritage." Welcome, John. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just do that. Right, and hopefully, whoops, my PowerPoint is now up on people's screens and they can see it. Okay, so as you can see, I'm talking about law and heritage. And yes, it really is complicated, although an awful lot of people in the heritage field seem to think it's a lot easier than it actually is. Actually, this topic goes way back to when I started in heritage. It goes back to when I was doing my PhD more years ago than I now care to remember. And one of the things that I noticed when I started looking at heritage was that every country in the world, and I mean every country in the world, has some sort of body of law relating to its patrimony, not always being applied, not always applied very well, sometimes completely ignored, but nonetheless there is a body of law relating to its cultural patrimony. And Henry Clear, writing in 1989, coined a very nice phrase, and he actually says that heritage is governed by legislation. And that phrase got into my head, and so that was what drove me to get into the area of researching into heritage and try to understand how heritage is governed by legislation and basically what law does to heritage. Because it's so universal, though, we tend to treat it as inevitable. It's one of the great questions of, oh, how do you know, if somebody says we should do something like this in heritage, somebody somewhere will always ask, well, how do you put that into law? Because we assume that that's the way that we should treat the heritage. Of course, it isn't inevitable. It's a way of treating things that the West in particular has very successfully exported to the rest of the world. Heritage was invented in Europe, and governing heritage by legislation is the way that we've been doing it since the 19th century, and that's what we have taken out to the rest of the world, and colonial authorities have then imposed that on everybody else, and it's been picked up by every other country in the world since. So it's a very successful export of the West, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, nonetheless, it is extremely successful. What laws do is pretty much the same everywhere, which is itself quite interesting, but it's not always done the same way everywhere, and that's a really crucial thing. It's one of the reasons why thinking about law and heritage is actually quite complicated. They define what is considered to be heritage, you know, how by age, how old it is may be, or by particular type of object, or by a particular style of importance. They determine what can be done to it and what can't be done to it. They determine who has the rights of ownership and control, whether it's the state, whether it's a state agency or some other body, or whether individuals are allowed to have control and ownership of heritage. And they usually also list the sanctions for improper use. So if you do something you're not supposed to do, it'll tell you what sort of punishment you'll get, whether it's a civil punishment like a fine, or whether it's a criminal punishment like prison or worse. But underneath all that, there's one thing that what laws really do. And basically all that they do is make heritage important. That's the fundamental purpose of having laws about heritage. The rest of it is fluff on the surface. That's, you know, sort of convenience. But what laws really do to heritage, the underlying purpose, is to make heritage important to us. And that's what laws do generally. They actually tell us those things that matter to us. So laws against murder assert the value of human life. Laws against theft assert the value of private property. Laws on heritage tell us that there are certain types of things which are too important to be treated randomly. They separate those things out from all other classes of object. They give authority over them to only certain types of person or institution. And they tell us what kind of importance it has by saying how it should be treated and how it should not be treated. So that's what laws really do. Fundamentally, all they do ultimately is make heritage important. And that, I think, is really interesting. It's also something that we take very little notice of in the heritage field because laws are so universally applied and because they are so ubiquitous, we don't actually ask the question, what do laws really do? But this is what laws really do, is just important. But it also becomes important, I think, to try and understand how laws work in a particular context. As I've said, you know, laws don't all say the same things everywhere, although they cover the same sort of issues. The way that it's done is different in different places. And so to understand how laws work in a particular place and why they work in that particular way, you need to look beyond the law itself to a set of local ideologies. In particular, who it is that's deemed to carry proper authority. Is it the state? Is it particular kinds of people who have particular kinds of expertise or skill? Is it ordinary citizens who can do what they like? It's about what are the proper limits of law and government. What can laws cover? What can't laws cover? What can government do and what can't government do? And that's something that varies from place to place and culture to culture. Not all places in the world have the same set of rules about who can do what and how. And there's also there's a question of what constitutes heritage, and by extension, what doesn't constitute heritage in any particular place. And these are not the same across the world. What is classed as heritage in, for example, the UK may not be classed as heritage, although they have something similar somewhere else. None of those things are natural or inevitable, but are to do with the way a particular culture works, the kind of thinking that is engaged in that culture and how it differs from other places. So there's nothing inevitable or natural about any particular approach to heritage. And I find it very interesting very often going to conferences and I'm listening to people argue about whether they do it better in this country than they do it in that country. And what they miss is that there are fundamentally different ideas about how things should be done generally that are being applied. And nobody notices that that's why there is these differences of approach. And that makes cross-cultural comparison of laws really hard. I mean, it's quite a common thing in heritage studies for people to want to carry out a comparison between one part of the world and another part of the world, between France and Britain, or the USA and Britain, or I don't know, China and Germany or something. But actually, it's much more difficult than that. You can carry out comparison, but only after you've adjusted for those fundamental differences of ideology. And I've picked up just a couple of examples of the kinds of things. If private property is highly valued in a place, then you can't have a system which gives all authority to the state, because it'll be resisted, because private property is highly valued. Elsewhere, where they think that that sort of thing naturally belongs to the state, then any private ownership will be regarded as something aberrant and different and challenging. Similarly, if you have a place where authority vests in particular categories of person, then you can't give authority to others who do not fall within that category of person, because it won't be accepted as being legitimate and being right. And an example I can think of was the attempt in Holland to set up the same kind of professional body for archaeologists that we have in the UK, the USA, and some other countries, because there's no tradition of independently self-governing professions in Holland, and so they wouldn't recognise that you could actually do that. It caused immense problems in trying to set that up. Because you can't do cross-cultural comparison, you can't easily transfer approaches from one place to another either. You can do it, but again, you have to adjust for those differences of ideology. And again, I've got the same two examples. If private property is highly valued, then you can't set up a system where absolute state ownership of heritage can be operated, because it will be resisted by those people who value private property. Similarly, you can't give authority to particular kinds of person if they're not the kinds of person that are generally accepted as being the kind of person it's legitimate to give authority to. So you can't simply say, oh, that is a system that works well over there, let's apply it here, because it may not work, and very often it doesn't. And I've seen attempts to do that in a number of countries over the past few years. And universally, they fail, because they fail to take into account the fact that there's fundamentally different ideas about how things work operating in the two places. So I've taken as an example the problem of metal detectorists on archaeological sites. Being an archaeologist, this is close to my heart, of course. There are three approaches, it seems to me. You can have an absolute ban, and that's state control of devices and their use. You can allow their use under restrictions, usually giving authority to professionals and experts in various sorts to determine where and how these things can be used. Or you can have no limits on their use, and you're simply relying on the users of these things to recognise the value and the sort of places they should not be using them on. And basically every one of those approaches is applied somewhere. They're mutually exclusive, so you can't apply two together, but every one of these is applied somewhere in the world. And which solution is deemed appropriate depends on the attitudes and expectations of the people in that sort of area, and the effectiveness of the system depends also on those local attitudes and expectations. Although it's worth pointing out that none are applied absolutely perfectly anywhere in the world. There's always somebody who doesn't like the way it's being done. But nonetheless, it does ultimately depend on relying on those attitudes and expectations of what is right and proper, and who can do what, where, and to what. So what does this mean for heritage studies? It means that we must go beyond the surface phenomena, the specifics of law in this particular instance, to understand the underlying ideology that creates the situation and the conditions under which heritage is created and how it's managed. And we also need to understand how they came to be the way they are, because they will have historical roots, sometimes quite deeply into the development of that particular cultural form. What it does mean, of course, is that we can't take laws for granted. They're not simple tools to regulate others, usually others' behaviour or our own. They are ideological statements, and we need to understand the ideology that they are representing. And nor is it right to just simply accept them as controls on our own approaches, because they're not inevitable. because no particular way of dealing with things is inevitably correct or inevitably appropriate. It doesn't follow that, you know, we have to do what laws say or accept them as being legitimate for everywhere. It does mean also that we need to examine closely and honestly what we do, how we do it, and fundamentally to ask what we are really for. I mean, it's one of those underlying questions that, again, we tend not to ask is, do we need something called heritage at all? And if we do need it, what for? What purpose does it serve? Because we've declared it to be important. That's what the laws do. The laws confirm that these things are important. So why do we need them? And it's a question that I think we tend not to ask when we ought to. So to summarize, laws do a lot more than protect heritage. They act as forms of control over those aspects of culture that determine who we are, because that's fundamentally what heritage does. If you want to know who we are, you look to see at the kind of cultural heritage that we attach to. And they're very powerful weapons in a war of beliefs because they represent particular forms of ideology. They represent particular assumptions about how the world works and how the world should work. And if you subscribe to the laws and subscribe to those ideas, then you are subscribing to the underlying idea that the law represents. So in looking at laws in heritage, I think it's always worthwhile asking, what are they requiring us to believe in? And then we have to ask ourselves whether we actually believe it. And if so, why do we believe it? Or if we don't, why don't we believe it? And then, as heritage professionals, act towards the heritage and the rest of the world accordingly. So if you don't believe that should have absolute control over people's pasts, but laws say that that is in the authority of the state exclusively, then there is a disjuncture there, and that needs to be faced and addressed. It's not automatically the case that the state has authority. It may not do. And that's basically what I was going to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. We'll now listen to Shubhangni.
Hello, everyone. I will just share my window. Okay, hope everyone can see that.
Yes, we can.
Excellent.
If you could make it, yeah, perfect.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thank you to the organizers of the Heritage and Colonialism discussion group at Cambridge for inviting me. I am very pleased to be able to share and speak about a portion of my doctoral research, which is a part of studying the larger practices of heritage through ideas of ownership and expertise in the context of Shekhawati Havelis, which were residential mansions built by Marwari businessmen in provincial Rajasthan. I'll of course explain more about these. Today I will briefly lay out the context and relationship of my project with the idea of heritage ethics, specifically when heritage becomes a burden for those it belongs to, or who actively engage with it in everyday basis, and its relationship with heritage expertise. Dr. Carman, of course, has worked way more extensively and robustly on these topics of heritage expertise, and I can't possibly hope to compete with him on this. But my attempt here is to give you a window on one of the ways in which these continued conceptual legacies play out in the case of South Asian heritage and in provincial Rajasthan. So since we're limited with our time, let me just briefly walk you through the flow of my presentation here so you're able to locate where I am. So I'll start first with what are Havelis and how are they contextualized within the region of Shekhawati, Rajasthan. So a Haveli, known to South Asian audiences as a type of residential mansions modeled around one or more courtyards, is an architectural form found across India and Pakistan, but also has global roots in the contemporary space. For instance, the courtyard houses of Morocco, China, and historically, they can also be traced back to the medieval houses of Britain, ancient houses of Rome, as far back as Mesopotamia, and in the Indian subcontinent, the colonial style bungalow of the 20th century was also styled on the lines of the Havelis. Simply put, they involve a gallery of rooms wrapping around one or more courtyards in 1 to 3 story structures. Shikha Jain, in her 2004 work, traces the archetype of the Haveli form through its architectural features and usage. She argues that it is difficult to pinpoint a Haveli type just by the characteristic of the courtyard, rather should be extended to looking at both its physical identification and what she calls social definition. The social definition would include considerations of both users and usage, wherein it has been observed that construction of such buildings would necessarily involve the patronage of using personal funds of economically elite classes. These groups would include the Rajputs, which were the warrior or kingly classes, Marwari traders, which mainly comprised of merchants and banking classes, Muslim nobles, royal doctors, and the like. The use of the Havelis would perform both residential and professional purposes, where the courtyard would be the symbolic space for private rituals, everyday life, and entertainment. So as you can see on the photo on the left side, there's a courtyard in the middle, and there are a gallery of rooms that are wrapping around it. And as you enter through the entrance that you can see, you will enter a more private residential courtyard, hence segregating the personal and the professional spaces. So in the context of my field site in Shekhawati in Rajasthan, these Havelis subscribe to a similar architectural layout as I explained, but with one notable exception. Built between the 1850s and 1940s for the most part, these Havelis were built mainly by affluent Marwari merchants as they capitalized on the declining political power of the Rajputs and the entrepreneurial opportunities presented by the British in India. They're of particular aesthetic interest in domestic and international tourism circles because of the rich and vibrant frescoes that adorn these limestone buildings. These are some of the examples of the frescoes from the region. As you can see through the images, they depict scenes from Hindu religious folklore, Rajasthani life, and even imaginings of colonial life back in England. This in particular is conjectured to be a result of aesthetic aspirational imaginations of the Haveli owners, many of whom had shifted to other parts of India and would send money back to the region to have artists express these imaginations through this specific fresco painting style. Now, there's been some controversy, and I don't have the time to be able to go into it very deeply about whether these are actually frescoes because they don't subscribe to the chaste Italian categories of either wet fresco or dry fresco, which may also give you an idea about the colonial ideas or the Western hegemonic ideas at play. But these are not painted on the wall directly. These are paintings that are embedded within the lime plaster, so they act somewhat like what frescoes do. And I like my stand is that they're a fresco hybrid and not necessarily declassified to just mere murals. Now, this is the crux of basically what my doctoral project is about, and it may help you contextualize really the specific subset that I'll go into later about heritage ethics. So, which is what are heritage afterlives? My starting point for this is Hilal Ahmed's influential work on the afterlives of Indian monuments. He has written in the context of the Jama Masjid, the Taj Mahal, and the Babri Masjid in India. His work, which contextualizes these buildings through their multifaceted use value, through the creation of various publics, draws attention to both the historical trajectory of heritage memory and its mobilization to engineer multifaceted contemporary use through state-sanctioned heritage narrative, religious historical memory, and political aspirations. But in the case of the Shekhawati Havelis, afterlives have to be contextualized differently. Thinking through Ahmed, they raise certain questions. What of historical buildings of heritage value that are A, not monumentalized, and B, fall within an institutionally commercialized urban space? Now, this particular belt that I'm talking about comprises of 3 administrative districts and are, for the most part, provincial and rural, which require its heritage buildings to be basically understood a bit differently than cityscapes. By looking at non-monumentalized private properties of heritage use in non-urban Rajasthan, I argue that heritage identity and adaptive reuse are not just a function of understanding the original historical purpose of a building vis-a-vis its contemporary usage, but rather multidimensional use value that may exist simultaneously or parallel with each other. These may not be observable through grand shifts of watershed political events, but the mundane everyday that is observed through slow events of the everyday. And this can be observed as these Havelis struggle between fulfilling adequate requirements of contemporary small town residential living and being of historical and heritage interest by outsiders. By outsiders, I mean both, non-Shekhavatis of both local, domestic, and international visitors. Qualifying as living heritage because of their historicity and active use by community residents, Shekhawati Havelis are active sites for non-institutionalized tourism, film and media backdrops, community mobilization, and architectural conservation efforts. At times, the same Haveli can be the near simultaneous site for all of these, further requiring the need to contextualize heritage afterlives in these buildings. So here I have basically three examples. On the left, you can see one of these Havelis that has been converted by the owning family into a museum. All three of them are in Navalgarh and its surrounding town of Churiyajikar. Navalgarh was my primary field site. On the top right, you will see a residential Haveli. It's actually the Haveli that I stayed in during my fieldwork, and I rented out one of the rooms, but it would mostly stay empty for most part of the year. And on the bottom right, you will see one of a boutique heritage hotel that was converted by a non-Shekhawati owner, a businessman who came from outside, and he bought these Havelis and converted them into a cultural experience. And we will be touching back on another property that this gentleman has been developing. So coming back to how do we get to the discussion on heritage ethics here? While there are many parts to this discussion in the context of Shekhawati, I'll briefly discuss two aspects that can help us understand how heritage can become a burden. This happens when established universal norms, definitions, and institutionalized practice of heritage is at odds with the lived experiences, expectations, and aspirations of those who use them and are dependent on them and to whom they belong to. So let's first start with the frameworks of outstanding universal outstanding value, heritage of humanity, and the regime of lists that emerged from it. I'm sure most of you are perhaps familiar with these, but it's just useful to go over them. This concept, which gained much prominence due to UNESCO's World Heritage Convention of 1972, can be traced all the way back to UNESCO's inception in the aftermath of the World War II context, and has been a source of controversy in determining heritage sites that should have protection because of its recognition as heritage for all humanity. What becomes the instrument of such recognition is the creation of lists, that is, heritage sites that are recognized as heritage and should be protected as such when they're listed. Now, as you can see on this slide, I've laid out the definitions, orientations, and policy consequences of this concept. But what I want to draw your attention to is this. The idea of listing is not new per se, but finds its way to join countries with colonial legacies like India, where the British thrust to make Indians accountable for their heritage through the Archaeological Survey of India, or ASI, and legislation like the Ancient Monuments and Preservation Act of 1904, also known as the AMPA 1904, was also realized through lists. Colonial legacies get extended in seemingly post-colonial setups by deciding what is and what isn't heritage and how it will be treated. Work that the critical heritage studies movement has took alongside critical approaches to heritage that Dr. Carman and his contemporaries have taken up and we come to much appreciate. But the story is not about lists. It's about what the actions and ideas around listing ensued. The creation of heritage as institutionally recognized and institutionally governed. Let's backtrack a little to the work of the ASI and AMPA 1904 that I just mentioned. So while we do not have time to go through their provisions in detail, the processes behind their formulation and the effects of their executions find their echo in the contemporary heritage space in India as well, which is why I feel they're worthy of discussion. The Ancient Monuments and Preservation Act, or AMPA 1904, was passed under Viceroy Curzon. It listed buildings of interest in its preservation lists and made its Indian owners liable for taking adequate care of them. In the event of identified negligence or destruction of material fabric, the owner was fined, or worse, his listed property was acquired by the government in perpetual guardianship. In the case of the ASI, its Director General at the time, John Marshall, produced a conservation manual in 1923, which was used as the guidebook for all preservationists working in India at the time, especially those under the government. We can also talk about like how is it that in this colonial setup you did have some archaeologists that broke away from the government and were working independently, but this was still the defining training and the guidance that they used to be able to carry out their work. Marshall was appointed by Curzon in 1902 and was left responsible to carry out ASI's work within the provisions of the AMPA 1904 after Curzon resigned in 1905. As Indra Sen Gupta elaborates in her 2013 work, A Conservation Code for the Colony, Marshall grappled with designing preservation stratagems in line with movements and ideologies in Europe, particularly those that emphasized on freezing the material fabric of the historical buildings as much in the present moment as possible, with the only interventions made towards arresting further damage or repairing structural integrity. The result of this was that whoever engaged with these buildings differently, especially those who had a different idea of use, were positioned as destroyers and were treated as such. John Marshall's 1923 manual is still one of the major guiding forces behind ASI's heritage work in India today. That is a recognition of heritage that is listed and the distancing of the material fabric from the human lives that engage with it. So how do these legacies play out in the context of Shekhawati? Today, I'll be talking about mainly heritage burdens, but I think it's also maybe interesting to talk about heritage burdens vis-a-vis heritage desires. So today, Shekhawati is as our homes to tenants. Shekhawati Havelis are homes to tenants, caretakers, and branches of owning families that didn't move away. They're developed as boutique heritage hotels by enterprising outsiders and Marwari families that want to remodel them as self-sustainable commercial assets. They're also vehicles for realizing urban aspirations and modern development, leading to demolitions, building commercial marketplaces on lands with higher real estate values, and of course, many other uses. I think the best way to explain what I mean is to walk through the images in front of you, taken at two Haveli locations. One is Navalgarh, which is my primary field site. So these three photos are from there. And Fatehpur, which was one of my comparative sites that we'll just talk about in a moment. The three examples that you see in front of you, the extreme left is a site of a Haveli that was demolished in the main market area where the site had higher real estate value. The second are finished concrete buildings built by residents after demolishing their Havelis in favor of more updated modern houses, one with lower maintenance costs and more amenable to plumbing and technological upgrades. The third is a Haveli bought by a non-Shekhawati businessman, the gentleman whose hotel I showed you earlier, for the purposes of refurbishing it and turning it into a museum slash interactive knowledge center and a boutique hotel. He also curates and runs the hotel on similar lines that I showed you earlier. And his attempt is to bring in an international aesthetic to appeal to an Indian elite and foreign tourists who might be visiting the area. Now, all these stakeholders have an active interest in Shekhawati and what it can offer. While my attempt here is not to condone or condemn what are the different ways people go about their buildings, but to offer an insight into what happens when they choose to break away from established expectations of what should be done with these buildings. Academic and semi-academic literature, heritage bodies, and tourist narratives often found to the dismay, point to the dismay of these Havelis being abandoned, ruined, or being used in very commercial ways that alter the material fabric of these buildings in irretrievable fashions. Residents are charged with not taking care of their buildings and using the visual of everyday use practices like electric meters, clotheslines, plumbing, and cement repair as evidence of heritage disregard at best and vandalism and destruction at worst. I find this to be a very provocative photo. It always elicits reactions when I use it for presentations. So as you can see, the larger structure is that of an older Haveli, and whoever the owner is has kind of carved out a shopping center in the middle of it. Now, the point is like whether this fits within our ideas of adaptive reuse of heritage buildings really doesn't matter. But the point is, sometimes this is how people make use of their buildings that are not just their heritage, but also their homes and sources of their livelihood. Now we move on to heritage burdens. This is a Haveli which was turned into a heritage hotel by a French Fatehpur in the late 2000s. The attempt was to create a curated heritage Haveli hotel that would utilize and demonstrate Shekhawati artisanship and artistry, and would be for a higher paying clientele that would be able to support its upkeep. So the photo that you see on the right hand side was something I pulled off the internet when this Haveli was fully functioning as an active hotel. However, the region sees perennial waterlogging problems due to the local government's inadequacy in road building measures, which kind of led to the Haveli kind of being abandoned. This is in the immediate post-COVID stage, if anything can be post-COVID, and was a photo that I clicked when I started my fieldwork in July 2022. As you can see in these photos, layers of ill-made roads over the years have rendered Haveli entrances to sink as low as 5 feet below the ground, leading to rainwater and sewage seeping in during the monsoon months, dubbing Fatehpur to be locally called as the water bowl of Shekhawati. Haveli owners in Fatehpur are thus desperate to either sell or demolish their Havelis for more habitable residences. Resident concerns here are not central to preservation of heritage values or of their Havelis, but striving for basic lifestyle necessities like modern plumbing, electricity, access to other parts of their town. This case of apathetic governance and institutional support, having access to the road outside their homes and preventing water from seeping in may require a complete demolition. Heritage preservation in these circumstances shares a difficult relationship with the human right to live with dignity, where the burden of heritage preservation falls on the most vulnerable stakeholders. To conclude, these are some of my brief takeaways. One is that heritage burdens, especially in this context, can be understood as a complication between the practice of heritage by institutional experts, by governments, by anybody who has a stake in practicing top-down heritage, and the experience of heritage by those who use it. Heritage, therefore, here becomes a burden with the limitations of conservation and adaptive use in the face of contemporary living requirements and infrastructural development. So in the example like I just showed you, uh, I'm sure there are many ways in which solutions can be sought to be able to save the Haveli, even if it doesn't, apart from demolition. But when the people themselves that are living inside do not have the kind of support that may allow us to seek these alternative measures, we have to look at how heritage can sometimes become a burden and how people may choose to do very different things with their buildings as works best for them and seems more intuitive at the time. These burdens highlight the granularity of everyday hardships, and these are made visible through multifaceted aspirations to live a life of dignity and the failures of state and institutional structures to support them. So ethical considerations step in when we try and understand why people choose to do things differently with their heritage than the expectations that have been set out by the expert praxis. And what does this do for inserted stakeholders that have limited views or different views? Thank you so much.